So you've sent over this pretty substantial stack of materials, and it's got me thinking about the future and, with the 2025 election coming up, what a potential future for the country might look like. We're looking at this document, Mandate for Leadership, and it seems to lay out a pretty clear roadmap for what a conservative president might try to do if they were to win the White House.
Yeah, it's more than just a list of policy goals, you know. This is a strategic blueprint. They're
Yeah.
talking about completely reshaping how the government works, what its role should be in our lives. It's really a playbook for putting a conservative stamp on pretty much every corner of the federal government.
It's pretty bold, to say the least. I mean, the authors,
Yeah.
they clearly don't see the current state of things as sustainable. They even use the phrase, I think, reverse the tide when talking about what they call cultural Marxism and how it's affecting our institutions.
Yeah, that's a really loaded phrase. And it really kind of sets the tone for the whole document. They're presenting this idea that America's facing a moment of crisis, that traditional values are under attack, and that, a really dramatic shift is needed to restore what they call true American values.
Okay, so let's break down some of the big themes in this vision. And one that jumps out right away is this idea of restoring the family. It pops up everywhere in this document and seems to touch everything from education and healthcare to how welfare programs are structured.
It's central to their whole philosophy. They want to strengthen the traditional family unit and make it, the bedrock of American society again. And it's not just about policy changes, it's about a shift in mindset. You see this big emphasis on personal responsibility, on promoting self-reliance, that kind of thing.
So less about government handouts and more about giving families the tools to be self-sufficient. Is that what you're getting at?
Exactly. They believe the current system, with all the safety nets and the social programs, has actually created a culture of dependency. And they're looking to kind of break that cycle. We can get into some specific examples later on, like in education and healthcare, where you really see this idea playing out.
And speaking of big changes, we've got to talk about this idea of dismantling what they call the administrative state. This isn't just about making the federal government a little bit smaller. They're talking about significantly reducing its power, its reach, its influence on everything.
Right. They want to dramatically shrink the size and scope of a lot of federal agencies, especially the ones that they see as overstepping their boundaries. We're talking big changes to environmental regulations, how intelligence agencies work, all sorts of things.
They even suggest getting rid of the Department of Homeland Security altogether. I mean,
Yeah.
that's a pretty radical idea.
Yeah, it's definitely going to turn some heads. They basically argue that DHS has become this bloated and ineffective bureaucracy and that its responsibilities could be handled better by other existing agencies. We can unpack that a bit later and see how they envision that actually working.
Yeah, it's definitely a bold move, no question about it. And it's not just about taking power away from the federal government. It seems like they also want to make sure that whoever the president appoints to these positions has more direct control over how things are run.
They really emphasize that. Their argument is that the bureaucracy in Washington has become so entrenched that the president needs to be able to appoint people who are completely aligned with their vision, people who won't face resistance from career government employees who might have different ideas.
So it's about giving the president a more direct line to enacting their agenda, even if it means maybe bypassing some of the traditional checks and balances that are supposed to be built into the system.
Yeah, that's the core of it. And they're anticipating pushback. They use this term deep state to describe the forces within the government that they see, as opposed to their goals. They believe it's going to take, real courage, real conviction to push through these changes.
Okay, lots to think about already. Let's shift gears a bit and talk about another key theme that comes up, confronting China.
Yeah, that's the other major pillar of their vision for America's future. They're very clear about this. China is the single biggest threat to the U.S., and they're advocating for a much more confrontational stance, talking about things like strategic decoupling from China, which would have massive implications for the global economy.
So if they're talking about dismantling the Department of Homeland Security, where do all the responsibilities, all the different things that DHS does, where does all that go? I mean, you can't just get rid of border security or disaster response.
Well, yeah, you're right. It's a massive undertaking. And the document does actually get into some specifics. Like, for instance, they propose creating this entirely new agency. It would be focused specifically on immigration. So think, merging parts of ICE, Customs and Border Protection, maybe even some offices from Health and Human Services that deal with, unaccompanied minors, that sort of thing.
Wow, so kind of mega immigration agency. I mean, that sounds like it could be a a bureaucratic nightmare in and of itself. What about everything else? FEMA, the Coast Guard, Secret Service, where does it all land?
They've thought about all of that. So the Coast Guard, they argue, should basically become part of the Navy. Really focus on protecting U.S. waters, resources, that sort of thing. And FEMA, they think, should be streamlined, mostly there for really catastrophic events, the big ones. A lot of the day-to-day stuff, they want to shift that responsibility to state and local governments.
So less federal involvement in, say, like everyday natural disasters or smaller scale emergencies. That's a pretty big shift. And what about the Secret Service? Protecting the president, that's got to be important to them, right?
They actually want to streamline the Secret Service's mission, too. They say it should focus exclusively on protection, no more financial investigations or anything else. They argue that having these two very distinct missions has actually been a problem. It's led to distractions, even security lapses. They believe, a more focused agency would be far more effective in the long run.
It's definitely a bold move. I'm still wrapping my head around the idea of no more DHS. It's been, such a fixture since 9/11.
It shows you how seriously they are about shaking things up. They really see the current approach to national security as fundamentally flawed. This isn't about, just making a few tweaks here and there. They're talking about a complete overhaul. But DHS isn't the only target. Their plans for the military are equally ambitious.
Yeah, let's talk about that. They call for a leaner, more efficient military, laser-focused on China. What does that look like in practice?
Imagine a smaller force, but much more technologically advanced, strategically positioned. They want to cut back on the bureaucracy, reduce the number of generals, really rethink a lot of our commitments around the world. They say the priority is clear, modernizing the military for a potential conflict with China.
So does it mean less emphasis on traditional ground forces and more investment in things like hypersonic weapons, cyber warfare, maybe even achieving some kind of space dominance?
Exactly. They even suggest creating a Space Force Academy. They definitely see space as the next big frontier of warfare. And they believe that the U.S. has to, maintain its edge in that domain. But even with all this talk about future conflicts, they haven't forgotten about some of the challenges facing the military right now, like recruitment and retention.
That's been a big one in the news lately. How do they propose to address that?
Well, they talk a lot about the need to boost morale, like kind of revive that sense of esprit de corps, emphasizing traditional values, military readiness. That's their approach. They believe that focusing on patriotism, on national service, that will attract a new generation. It's a very specific vision, of what they believe the military should represent.
So we've got DHS, we've got the military. What about the intelligence community? Any big changes in store for them?
They're adamant that the intelligence agencies need to be laser-focused on China and other emerging threats. Streamlining bureaucracy. They even suggest that maybe it's time to rethink the role of the Director of National Intelligence.
So not just a change in priorities, but maybe a restructuring of how the whole intelligence apparatus operates.
Right. They seem to be arguing for a more agile and nimble intelligence community. They believe that technological superiority is absolutely essential, especially when you're talking about information warfare. It's about countering threats in the digital age.
It's a lot to take in. We're really talking about a pretty fundamental shift in how the U.S. approaches security, both here at home and on the world stage.
Oh, absolutely. And it goes even deeper than that. I mean, remember, this document also lays out plans for completely reshaping the role of government in everyday American life. There are big ideas about education, healthcare, welfare programs, how the government interacts with religious organizations. All of that is in here, too.
And that's where it gets really interesting. This is where it hits home for most Americans. They've got some pretty specific plans for how they want to change things. So let's dive into that.
Okay, so we're shifting gears now from, reshaping the military and intelligence to thinking about the role of government in our everyday lives.
And they're proposing some pretty dramatic shifts. I mean, they're talking about less government involvement in some really key areas, education, healthcare, social welfare, things like that. It all comes back to this idea of individual responsibility, empowering families to make their own choices. So let's start with education. School choice seems to be a really big deal to them. How would that actually work in their vision?
Well, imagine a system where the funding for education follows the child, not the school, right?
Yeah.
So instead of going directly to public schools, they want to give parents vouchers, maybe tax credits for private school tuition, really expand charter schools. It's all about giving parents more say in where their kids go to school.
So moving away from the traditional public school system towards more privately funded options.
That's the general idea. They argue that this kind of competition would actually improve the quality of education overall, and that, when you empower parents, you get better outcomes for students. But it's not just about where kids go to school. They also want to see a real shift in what's being taught.
What do you mean?
Well, they talk about refocusing on what they call core subjects, math, science, history, that sort of thing. But they also want to see a much stronger emphasis on traditional values. The idea is that schools should be reinforcing those values, not, undermining them.
Yeah. It sounds like they're trying to push back against what they see as a liberal bias in education these days.
You could definitely see it that way. Their argument is that education should be about preparing kids for success in life, not indoctrinating them with a particular ideology. Of course, critics would say that this kind of approach could actually end up disadvantaging kids from low-income families who might not have the same access to quality private schools, even with vouchers.
Yeah, it's a valid concern.
Yeah.
And it highlights the fact that, there are some potential trade-offs here when you're talking about this kind of radical restructuring. But education isn't the only area where they're proposing big changes. Healthcare is another one.
Oh, absolutely. They see the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare, as a prime example of government overreach. And they want to move away from that model towards something much more market-driven.
So less government regulation, more reliance on private insurance.
Exactly. They believe that if you increase competition among insurance providers, give patients more control over their healthcare choices, that's what's going to lead to lower costs and better outcomes. They're really big on health savings accounts, things like that, a more consumer-driven approach.
But, of course, the other side of that argument is that this could leave millions of Americans without access to affordable healthcare, especially those with pre-existing conditions.
It's definitely one of the biggest sticking points in this whole debate over healthcare reform. And, the document itself doesn't really offer a lot of specifics on how they would actually address that issue, although they do talk about, making sure that those who truly need help, they'll be taken care of.
So it seems like they're trying to walk this tightrope between, their belief in limited government on the one hand, and on the other hand, this need to provide some kind of safety net for the most vulnerable.
Yeah, you see that tension throughout this document. It's about finding that balance between individual responsibility and social support, between free markets and some degree of government regulation. It's a tough needle to thread, for sure. And, if they actually try to implement these ideas, it's going to be a huge battle.
Well, it's clear that their vision for America is one where the federal government plays a much smaller role in many aspects of our lives. And that brings us to their proposals for welfare programs.
They're very clear in their assessment. They see the current system as broken. They argue that, instead of helping people escape poverty, it actually traps them in a cycle of dependency.
So they're not just talking about, like, cutting back on spending. They really want to change how welfare works at a fundamental level.
Yeah, absolutely. They're advocating for things like stricter work requirements, time limits on how long people can receive benefits, and really a renewed focus on personal responsibility. Their belief is that, by making these changes, you actually encourage people to become self-reliant. They can break that cycle of dependency.
Of course, critics would argue that those changes would actually end up pushing more people into poverty.
Yeah.
Especially people who are already struggling, maybe with disabilities, mental health issues, or a lack of job opportunities.
It's such a complicated issue. And there are valid points to be made on both sides. And the document does, it does emphasize that, of course, those who truly need help, they should get it. But they believe that the most compassionate thing you can do is to help people become self-sufficient in the long run.
Again, we see that recurring theme in how they approach the role of government. Empowering individuals, promoting self-reliance, reducing reliance on government handouts. But this idea of personal responsibility, it's not just about welfare. They also see a much larger role for religion in public life.
Yeah, they really emphasize this idea that faith is essential for a healthy society. They want to see a resurgence of what they call traditional religious values in America.
So are we talking less separation of church and state here?
They probably wouldn't phrase it that way, but yeah, they definitely believe that religious organizations should have a bigger role to play, particularly when it comes to things like providing social services, and that faith in general should be a more visible part of, the public square. So things like, making it easier for religious organizations to receive government funding or promoting religious freedom in schools and other public institutions.
It's a controversial idea, no question.
Mm-hmm.
And it definitely raises all sorts of questions about, the role of religion in what's supposed to be a pluralistic society. But it's clear they see faith as a unifying force, as a source of moral strength for the nation.
Right. It's all part of this bigger vision of, returning to what they see as traditional American values. They believe that these values are under attack, and they're willing to take some pretty drastic steps to try to, to restore them.
It's a vision that's definitely going to resonate with some Americans while, probably alienating others. But there's no doubt that if this vision were to be implemented, it would fundamentally change the relationship between the government and the people.
Absolutely. And, we've just scratched the surface here. I mean, we haven't even touched on their plans for America's role in the world, their foreign policy objectives, their economic vision. There's so much more to unpack in this Mandate for Leadership document. But hopefully this deep dive has given you a better sense of the big picture, the overarching themes, and just what the stakes might be for the country moving forward.
It's been eye-opening, to say the least. It's one thing to hear these ideas in the abstract, but seeing them laid out like this in such a concrete plan, a roadmap for action, it really brings it all to life. And it makes you realize, wow, the choices we make in this next election, they're going to have a real impact.
Couldn't agree more. The direction of the country really is up for grabs. It's up to each of us to stay informed, to really think critically about these issues, and make our voices heard.
Well said. And I want to thank you for joining me on this deep dive. It's been a lot to process, but I feel like we really dove in, and I have a much clearer understanding of what this conservative vision for America looks like.
It's been a pleasure exploring all of this with you. And remember, the conversation doesn't stop here. This is just the beginning.